For most of us, a horror movie is a fun way to spend a Friday night. There's just something about being scared that attracts us. But honestly, you don't need a fictional story to feel a chill run down your spine. Just turn on the news, read the paper, or even watch any of my videos, because real life, it's a horror show all on its own. To remind us of that, in this video, we're going to take a look at 5 events that sadly turned fatal. From a horrifyingly tragic club fire in Macedonia, to a stampede that occurred in Saudi Arabia with a hard-to-believe death toll, this week, we've got the lot. So grab a drink, draw the curtains, and let's get right into it. Air shows are amazing. The deafening sound of the engines, the energy of the crowd, the sheer thrill of watching something epic is hard to top. But that magic only holds when everything goes smoothly. Because when something goes wrong at an air show, it's usually catastrophic. Suddenly, they become the most terrifying thing that you can go to. With that in mind, this entry begins on September the 16th, 2011 in Reno, Nevada. That day, it was a big day. It was the Reno Air Races, a multi-day aviation event held each September at the Reno-Stead Airport. Starting in 1964, these races have always been an annual competition where pilots race highly modified aircrafts around a closed course, pushing their machines and their skills to the absolute limit.
What they do is build a number of pylons out in the scrub to mark out a course, and then they indulge in what can only be described as the fastest motorsport the world has ever seen.
Billed as the world's fastest motorsport, these races attracted over 100,000 attendees each year, with aircrafts flying just above the ground at over 500 miles an hour. However, in 2011, anticipation was high. Attendance surged, and that year saw one of the biggest turnouts in recent history. Around 150,000 people gathered at the Reno-Stead Airport, ready for a day of races. Now, throughout the day, everything went smoothly. There was no issues and no concerns until it came time for the event's crown jewel, the Unlimited Class race. This category was reserved for high-performance, heavily modified aircrafts where any propeller plane with any number of modifications or tweaks could compete. Among the competitors that year was 74-year-old Jimmy Leeward, flying a modified P-51D Mustang, a World War II-era fighter plane named the Galloping Ghost. Now, Jimmy was a seasoned stunt pilot as well as being a real estate developer. That year for the competition, he'd pushed the aircraft further than most would dare. His goal that year wasn't just to compete, but he wanted to win. He'd fitted a new Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 engine, added a custom canopy, fed the cooling system through a wing tank, and even cut down the wingspan. Everything was tuned for maximum performance. By around 4 p.m, the Unlimited Class race began. Spectators watched as 9 aircrafts took to the skies, each one heavily modified. Soon, they were screaming past them at incredible speeds. They were just a blur above the ground. Jimmy was flying aggressively, using his years of experience to chase the lead. By the time they were on lap 3, he was 4.5 seconds behind second place and 8.5 seconds behind the leader. It was still anyone's race. Then, at 4:24 p.m, disaster struck with brutal force. Out of nowhere, the plane suddenly pitched sharply upward and climbed steeply into the air. This sudden movement was not intentional. It was actually the result of a mechanical failure. A loose elevator trim tab had broken and caused Jimmy to lose pitch control. The G-forces from the climb were extreme, causing him to black out mid-flight. Now unconscious, and with no one at the controls, the Galloping Ghost rolled to the right and nosed over into a near vertical dive, headed straight towards the tarmac, straight towards the spectators. Within a blink of an eye, the aircraft slammed into the ground at around 445 to 460 miles per hour. All the fuel on board had been dispersed in the...
Like, that is messed up. Like, Of all the places he could have crashed, he crashes in the most densely populated area. Like, wow, that's a mess.
Crash, meaning it did not ignite on impact. Despite the absence of a fire, the aftermath was no less horrific. Jimmy Leewood, the pilot, was killed on impact. The VIP boxes, seated closest to the front, were hit directly by the plane. For those in that box, people were struck by wreckage with horrifying force. Some were crushed, others suffered fatal blunt force trauma, and some were torn apart by flying shrapnel. In total, 69 people were seriously injured, but sadly, multiple spectators were instantly killed. Survivors nearby were left with life-altering injuries. Limbs were severed, skulls were fractured, and many people were left with deep, devastating lacerations. First responders, many already on site, rushed into action, but the scene was just pure chaos. By the end of the day, 11 people had lost their lives, making it the deadliest airshow disaster in the US in nearly 40 years. Now, it's important to note that the Reno air races have always been intrinsically risky. Flying modified aircrafts is never that safe. In their 47-year history, 30 pilots had died, but this was the first time that spectators were among the dead. The remaining races that day were cancelled immediately, and 10 days later, 500 people gathered for a candlelit remembrance, honouring those who had lost their lives. The main question on everyone's mind was, what happened to cause the crash? Photos taken just before the impact appeared to show part of the tail section detaching mid-flight. The NTSB launched a full investigation and found evidence of extreme stress on the aircraft, buckling in the fuselage, and even visible gaps between the body and the canopy during flight. In their final report, released in August of 2012, the NTSB concluded that the likely cause of this crash was because Jimmy had reused single-use lock nuts in the left elevator trim tab system. These had loosened over time, allowing the tab to flutter uncontrollably. Because of this, a crack had developed, which then caused the whole system to eventually fail, causing total loss of pitch control. This investigation concluded with 7 safety recommendations, some of which included redesigning the course layout, moving seating farther from the flight path, as well as pilot G-force awareness training, and enhancing the ramp safety. Despite the tragedy, the Reno air races resumed in the following year. Still, despite these improvements, in 2023, citing safety concerns, as well as pressure from surrounding development, officials announced that the Reno State Airport would no longer host the event, stating that the races are now searching for a new home. But no matter where the event goes next, the memory of September the 16th, 2011 will never be forgotten. While safety protocols may improve, new rules may be written. For the injured, as well as the families of the 11 people lost, their whole lives changed that day, and the cost of that afternoon can never be undone. This next tragic case originates from Englishtown, New Jersey, on June the 21st, 2008, during the qualifying rounds for the 2008 Lucas Oil NHRA Super Nationals. If you're not familiar, the NHRA, or the National Hot Rod Association, is the governing body for professional drag racing in the United States, hosting some of the most extreme motorsports events worldwide. Every year at the Old Bridge Township Raceway Park, the NHRA hosted the Lucas Oil Super Nationals. In these Super Nationals, there's a variety of different class races, but the funny car class stands out as one of the most exciting, as well as the most dangerous. In the funny car class race, cars can be heavily modified, some capable of reaching speeds of over 330 miles an hour. Rather than petrol, these cars are driven by nitromethane, an incredibly volatile and high-performance fuel. These cars can generate over 12,000 horsepower, but of course, all that power comes at a price. Funny cars, coined because they looked funny and the name just sort of stuck, are extremely difficult to control and require expert handling to navigate safely. That day, around 30 to 50,000 people attended the races, eager to see some wild competition. Among the racers competing in the funny car class that day was 46-year-old Scott Kalita, a two-time NHRA world champion and the son of drag racing legend Connie Kalita. Scott grew up around racing and became one of the most fearless drivers in the sport. It was during the final round of qualifying when Scott's funny car made its run. Scott was flying down the track at speeds of over 300 miles an hour, but as he neared the finish line, something went terribly wrong. As Scott's funny car approached the end of the quarter-mile test track, the engine suddenly backfired, an all too common though dangerous occurrence in nitromethane-fueled drag racing. This backfire caused the engine to explode violently, damaging the parachutes that would usually release to slow the car down after crossing the finish line. Despite the failed parachutes, Scott managed to maintain control of the car and applied the mechanical brakes, still desperately trying to slow down in the 2,300-foot shutdown area, the stretch of track that existed to help vehicles slow down after completing the race. However, the car continued accelerating because of a locked clutch, meaning the engine power was still being transmitted to the rear wheels. The car continued to gain speed. There was no stopping it. After running out of road in the shutdown area, Scott's car reached 125 miles an hour as it entered the sand trap at the end of the track. This was only used in emergencies, meant to slow down a vehicle in the event of a failure. But Scott was going way too fast for even this. He went straight over this, went straight over a concrete wall, and then slammed into a piece of heavy equipment used by the ESPN broadcast crew for filming. Scott's car broke apart, and the largest piece of the wreckage, still with Scott inside, came to a rest 200 feet past the shutdown area. Witnesses described the scene as horrific. The deceleration forces at play here were extreme. Despite immediate medical attention, Scott was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. In a somber tribute, Scott's competitor Robert Height idled his car down the track the following day instead of racing, as a mark of respect for Scott's passing. This incident led to a significant overhaul in NHRA safety regulations to prevent similar accidents in the future. They shortened the race distance down, they improved the sand trap, and also reevaluated where equipment and personnel were allowed to be positioned during races, especially near the end of the track. Additionally, a new safety sensor was developed to prevent engine backfires from causing deadly crashes. This new safety sensor automatically shuts off the fuel pump and deploys the parachutes in the event of a malfunction. This became mandatory and has prevented many similar tragedies. This next case brings us to Belvidere, Illinois, a small industrial city in Boone County, not far from the Wisconsin border. On the evening of Friday, March 31st, 2023, this quiet, idyllic town would become anything but quiet. That evening, as darkness settled on the area, hundreds gathered at the city's historic Apollo Theatre for a much-anticipated sold-out rock show. With a capacity of just under 800, the venue offered a tight, loud atmosphere that people loved. But that Friday night, it was filled with around 260 concert-goers, performers, and staff. To all those present, the show went ahead despite advanced knowledge of severe and potentially dangerous weather. That morning, the Storm Prediction Center issued a high-risk warning for the surrounding area. While Belvidere was outside the core of the high-risk zone, it still sat under the risk of tornadoes. Despite these warnings, however, inside the Apollo, doors opened and the crowd gathered inside to shelter from the wind and enjoy a rock show. The first band, Crypta, began their set shortly after 7 p.m, but as they did, the atmosphere began to shift as the storm drew closer. Then, at 7:24 p.m, tornado sirens began sounding. Only then did officials pause the show as staff quickly began moving people towards the basement. However, just 20 minutes later, at 7:43 p.m, before all of the guests had managed to get to the basement, an EF1 tornado hit the theatre. Winds between 90 and 100 miles an hour tore into the building, ripping it apart like it was nothing. Instantly, big pieces of the building fell onto the sidewalk below, including the front facade and the marquee. Inside, however, things were far worse. A large section of the upper roof, roughly 3 to 5 feet thick, was torn away. As it did this, loads of debris came tumbling on inside, falling on concert-goers. As the dust settled, it was clear that many people had been buried and needed emergency help, putting their own lives in danger. Those who could began pulling debris off each other before emergency crews arrived. The Belvedere Fire Department, located just a few blocks away, responded within just 2 minutes. When they got there, they quickly realized that the entire building was at risk of collapse. Despite the place literally falling apart, firefighters continued rescue efforts, knowing time was critical. Over the next few hours, emergency personnel worked side by side, lifting debris and freeing those who were trapped and injured. Miraculously, despite all the danger, teamwork ultimately prevailed. Everyone who was buried was freed, and eventually civilians were ordered out of the building for their safety. Sadly, however, for one man, 51-year-old Frederick Livingston Jr., he was not so lucky. He was crushed by the collapsing roof, and despite paramedics' best efforts, he was pronounced dead at the scene. In the weeks that followed, the Apollo Theatre was condemned, and those injured and the family of Frederick were eager for someone to be held accountable. When you go to a concert, you expect that the organisers have properly considered your safety. Of course, while everyone in there knew the risks, they knew that a tornado may appear. That doesn't excuse the multiple warnings that were ignored throughout the day. And while they did briefly stop the show to get people into the basement, this was far too late. And regardless, they could have easily postponed the evening's fixtures, but instead, they chose not to. Instead, they chose to put many lives at risk. By March 2024, 11 lawsuits had been filed, including one from Frederick Livingston's family. The owners argued against these lawsuits, stating that guests were warned and labeled the tornado as an act of God. This next truly haunting entry unfolded on September the 24th, 2015, during the annual Hajj pilgrimage in Mina, Saudi Arabia. For a bit of background, the Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's a sacred pilgrimage that every Muslim is required to undertake at least once in their lifetime, provided they are able to do so financially and physically. Every year, millions of Muslims from all across the world gather in Mecca for this journey, which includes several days of prayer, ritual, and symbolic acts of devotion. One of the key rituals of the Hajj is the stoning of the devil, which takes place at the Jamarat Bridge in Mina. Here, pilgrims throw pebbles at 3 large pillars, symbolizing the rejection of temptation. This ritual, though deeply meaningful, is fraught with danger due to big crowds gathering in confined spaces, creating conditions.
Because isn't that religion also known to throw rocks at people that commit crimes or whatever? They kill them by stoning. Hopefully that's not what happens here.
Ripe for tragedies. The Jamarat Bridge and surrounding streets have historically been the site of crowd-related disasters just due to the sheer amount of people going down them, but nothing compared to 2015. That year, this tradition would turn into the deadliest tragedy in Hajj history. On that fateful morning of September the 24th, 2015, the Hajj pilgrimage was in full swing. As many as 2 million pilgrims were on their way to the Jamarat Bridge in Mina for the annual stoning of the devil ritual. The crowd, massive as ever, were making their way along Street 204 and Street 223, 2 roads leading to the bridge. At approximately 9 a.m, at the intersection of these 2 streets, two large groups of pilgrims converged from different directions. The dense mass of people began pushing against one another, and the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. Soon, there was just no room to move, no room to breathe, and people quickly began to panic. In the chaos, pilgrims were crushed, suffocated, and trampled as they were forced into confined spaces. The resulting crowd crush was the definition of hell on earth. As it always does in these cases, it suddenly became every man for themselves. Many began being trampled underfoot and crushed beneath the dense crowd, while others began to suffocate in the intense heat, with temperatures reaching 47 degrees that day. A full-scale disaster unfolded as over 4,000 emergency personnel, including the army, were dispatched to the scene, but what they were met with, none of them could prepare for. The scale of the disaster was overwhelming. By the time first responders got to those trapped in the crowd, many pilgrims were already dead. The bottleneck now lay hundreds of corpses of victims crushed and suffocated. In some photos that I won't show you, there's literally bodies everywhere. The majority of the dead died from compression asphyxia. It just doesn't even bear thinking about the scenes that were unfolding there. By the time the situation was fully under control, the government of Saudi Arabia officially reported that there had been 769 deaths, with 934 injured. At this point, many more were still missing, as victims were crushed in ways that often took days to identify them. This death toll of 769 is disputed, however. Independent experts estimate the death toll could be more like 2,431, which is insane. Despite the death toll clearly being way higher than reported, the death toll of 769 remained official at the time of the next year's Hajj, and even to this very day, the Saudi Arabia government never updated it. The Saudi Interior Minister claimed that the disaster was caused by a miscommunication as well as bad crowd management. He said that there were reports that pilgrims had not been properly informed of route closures, which led to the bottleneck of people moving in opposite directions. The exact cause of the crush still remains unclear. Saudi authorities, however, made no public admission of negligence. The Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia stated that the disaster was a result of fate, exonerating the government from any accountability for the tragedy. Now, this next entry only recently occurred, and legal proceedings are still ongoing. But I wanted to cover it now while it's fresh, because it truly shocked me to my core, and I just can't believe these kind of things are still happening. It begins in the small town of Kochani, located in East North Macedonia. About 100 miles from the capital, this quiet town of just 25,000 people is a very close-knit community. Everyone knows each other, but in the early hours of March 16th, 2025, that beautiful sense of community would be shattered forever. That night, a local hotspot situated on the outskirts of Kochani, called Club Pulse, was absolutely packed. That night, it was hosting a concert by DNK, one of North Macedonia's most popular hip-hop duos. Hundreds of people, many of them underage, had come out to see them. Excited fans, students, families, and teenagers looking for a night of music and fun. Now, Club Pulse was actually an improvised nightclub, operating inside a former carpet warehouse. Despite it being a club, where I'm assuming alcohol was being served, doormen allowed everyone inside of all ages. After all, what could possibly go wrong? By 2:30 a.m., the club was pulsing with energy. DNK was mid-performance, the crowd packed in tightly, dancing under strobe lights and smoke. They were having the time of their lives, and then came the pyrotechnics, indoor fireworks designed to flash and impress the crowd. But, as they always do when these things are used inside, as soon as they went off, things quickly turned horrific. Sparks shot upward and ignited the foam ceiling panels. At first, the band didn't notice. The lighting, the stage effects, and the loud music all masked what was happening, but within moments, after audience members began pointing and shouting, the band looked up and realized that something was very wrong. The ceiling, sadly like much of the venue, was cladded with flammable acoustic foam. One of the band members grabbed a fire extinguisher and rushed to the flames, trying to stop it right there on the stage, but it was already too late. The fire had already taken hold, feeding off the flammable foam and spreading at a terrifying speed. Realizing that things were going bad, the band stopped playing, and a voice grabbed the mic and shouted to the crowd, "Everyone out! Leave the building now! Faster! Faster!" The venue only had one fire extinguisher, no sprinklers, and no fire exits. Panic erupted. Some people tried to grab their friends and head towards the exit. Others hesitated for just a second, and that was all it took for them to lose their lives. Thick, black smoke began filling the club. The flames tore through the ceiling, melted the plastic, ignited the fabric, and rained burning plastic on those trying to flee the club. As they tried to escape, the lights went out, screams filled the air, and visibility dropped to near zero. Then came the stampede. Everyone rushed towards the only exit, a single narrow doorway at the front of the club. The back door was locked. Dozens were trampled, crushed in the chaos. Others collapsed from smoke inhalation or burns before they were able to escape. Just minutes after the fire began, the roof began to partially collapse, before firefighters had even arrived. The building just simply couldn't withstand the heat and the flames. Some people in the chaos trying to flee and escape through bathroom windows, only to discover that they had been barred over. It was a bloody horror, and I don't want to underestimate that. Firefighters arrived shortly after, but by then, much of the destruction had already occurred. The club's location in a tightly packed area in the outskirts of the town made it difficult to access. But once they did get inside, the scene was apocalyptic. The entire thing was collapsing in on itself, and on the floor lay many, many visible charred bodies. Firefighters worked to put out the remaining flames and search for any survivors, but by now, as I said, it was already too late. In total, 59 people were killed in the blaze, and over 150 people were injured, many suffering severe burns, leaving them in critical condition. Most of the victims were heartbreakingly young, aged between 16 and 48 years old. 6 of the dead were under 18. All had arrived just hours earlier, excited to see their favourite band, and now they were gone. Over 100 people that were burnt had to be transferred to hospitals in neighbouring countries because their burns were so severe and the hospitals were so full. Sadly, many of the dead carried no identification. This meant identifying them was a real struggle. Many victims had died from being crushed in the stampede, while others succumbed to the flames and the smoke. The band that was playing that night, D&K, were not immune either. One of the duo's lead singers died in the fire, along with 6 other members of the group's support team. Vladimir Blazev survived. He suffered severe burns to his face and his hands and was given oxygen therapy at the scene. He was the only surviving member of his band. Everyone else, gone. As the names of the dead began to emerge, the heartbreak only deepened. Panicked parents began flooding hospitals and morgues, searching for their children. For far too many, the worst had already occurred. They faced something that no parent ever should, the death of their child.
It's my only child, and he died. What am I supposed to do? Local officials should be hurt in the same way that I'm hurt. I've been there all night. They can't even get the bodies out. They can't pull them out. There must be 200 people inside. Children burnt, beyond recognition. There are corpses, just corpses inside. They can't pull them out, not even with helicopters, special forces, and the mafia bosses just putting money into their pockets. Goddamn money.
The small town of Kochani was left brutally stunned. As I said, it's a very small and tight-knit community. Losing 59 young people is just insane. Endless families were shattered overnight. The entire town mourned. On March the 17th, the day after the fire, Macedonia's Prime Minister held a press conference, and here he revealed that only 22 legal nightclub licenses existed in the country, and Club Pulse was not one of them. Turns out it had been operating illegally for years. The license that they had been falsified, signed off by corrupt officials, and never even entered into the registry. Bribes had been paid to look the other way. The venue should have never opened, let alone hosted a crowd. To make things worse, the walls weren't fireproof and the ceiling was lined with flammable acoustic foam. Not only this, but the drywall used in its construction contained asbestos, a known carcinogen. Unlike other materials, asbestos doesn't burn. It breaks apart under high heat, releasing microscopic fibers into the air, which are then inhaled. Everyone inside, survivors, first responders, even nearby residents, may have inhaled the asbestos. The health minister for North Macedonia urged everyone at the scene to get checked, warning that its lethal effects may not show up for years. 7 days of national mourning were declared. The Prime Minister called the loss irreparable and promised justice.
Нема да има милост, тоа јас и вчера го кажав, тоа ќе го повторам и денеска. Кој сака нека биде. Кој сака дека биде, од каква сака нека биде етничка припадност и од која сака нека биде политичка партија. Тоа што се случувало е повеќе од криминал. Ова е би рекол масовно убиство кое што некој го дозволувал за пари, за мито, за корупција да се случи.
A candlelit vigil was held in Kočani, but across the country, grief gave way to rage. Knowing that officials had traded safety for money, thousands took to the streets. In Kočani, protesters hurled bottles, rocks, and eggs at government buildings. The windows were smashed. They descended on more government buildings and demanded that the mayor of Kočani show his face, but by then he'd already resigned due to the scandal.
So many kids died here because of that corruption. We don't want it here, guys. Yes, so many friends. I have so many friends here, but I can't. So many people died here because of that corruption.
The crowd vandalized the classic cafe owned by the club owner, and later that night, they overturned his car and even tried to set his house on fire. On March the 18th, thousands gathered at Macedonia Square in the capital, lifting their phones towards the sky in a silent remembrance. On March the 20th, thousands dressed in black attended mass funerals to pay their respects to the young people lost far too soon. In Kočani alone, 30 victims were laid to rest. Then came the arrests. Police detained and arrested Dejan, or Diko, the club's owner, as well as his son. 7 police officers were also detained for approving a catering license despite blatant safety issues. A former state secretary in the Ministry of Economy was also arrested for signing off the falsified documents. A band member, 3 former mayors, and several security guards were also charged. The guards were charged for letting in underage guests and allowing pyrotechnics in the overcrowded, unsafe venue. In total, 13 people were arrested for their contributions to the tragedy, with the government promising more arrests to follow. Authorities have since launched a nationwide sweep of nightclubs and cafes, uncovering dozens of violations and shutting down multiple venues to prevent another tragedy like this. However, for the families of the 59 people lost, there's just no making this right. There will always be a hole where that loved one was. It's just absolutely tragic. I hope that all these people are held fully accountable, because this wasn't just a fire. This was a result of greed, negligence, and corruption. And all of it should have never happened. But that is the end of the video. May all those featured rest in peace. But holy moly, yet again, we're going to do this completely unscripted. Just going to see what I naturally say about the cases. But that last one, wow, we'll get to it, but I just can't believe that this kind of stuff is still occurring. Starting from the top, we've got the Rena Ware show. The pilot had heavily modified the plane, but he had reused these locking nuts, which led to the tragedy. While he shouldn't have done this, the people that were organising the race should have been checking his plane to make sure that the modifications he were making were actually fine, that the plane was still airworthy. It's tragic for the people that lost their lives, and the footage that emerged from this tragedy is just insane. Then we've got the tornado in Belvedere. I don't know what these organisers were thinking. They had warnings all throughout the day. They even had a warning before the show started, but they still didn't cancel the show. They still let it go ahead, and only when the alarms went off did they start evacuating people. By then, it was just far too late. Nobody should have lost their lives just going to a theatre to watch a show, but it was a miracle that many more didn't die. Then we've got the funny car racing incident. It's tragic that the spectators had to watch this all unfold right in front of them, but there is some good that came from this. Obviously, they had that chip that was invented that stopped this thing happening in the future, but it's sad that Scott had to pay the ultimate price. Then we've got the insane stampede in Saudi Arabia. That one I had to read twice. I had to read 3 times to double check that I was looking at the right numbers, because 2,000 plus people dying in a single day, I can't even comprehend it. I can't believe that I haven't heard of this before. Over 4,000 personnel were sent to the scene to aid those injured and those trapped. It's just a crazy number of people, and while I've covered some stampedes in the past, this has got to be the worst.
Yeah, and it makes you think, like, I've heard a lot of those, not a lot, but it's happened quite a few times at concerts and stuff. If you ever see that something is super packed, be aware that you could eventually get crushed by the crowd if it gets too packed. So definitely, like, it's good to keep that in mind. Like, all these situations, that's why I think humans are so interested in seeing and hearing gruesome stories like this, not because we relish that. It's more because it's just crazy things that don't usually happen, and it's like you want to prepare, you want to know what's out there. Just like serial killers that are out there, just like you want to know threats that are out there that could actually end your life, and crowds and stuff, people never think that it could turn into that, but it very easily can when there's too many people gathered in one area. And especially if you're in an enclosed area, like the 2,000 people that lost their lives, they were on a highway or whatever. There was nowhere else for them to go unless it was like jumping off a bridge, and then they all get crushed. While in those situations in the future, for anyone watching this, like, it's definitely good to know that that could happen, and keep that in the back of your head, and be ready. Like, yeah, 99% of the time it's not going to happen, but it's good to know that these things, like, could happen. Same thing with, like, 1,000 Ways to Die. Like, you see, it's a show that was really popular for a long time on Spike TV, and I used to watch it, and a lot of people have watched it. But it's like you learn how the weirdest, craziest ways that people die, and then you have that in the back of your head, like, oh, okay, this could happen. If there's a machine, you work in a plant, and the machine is turning a roller really fast, you could get caught in it, and it could spin you and kill you instantly. Like, things like that, it's just good to know.
And last, but certainly not least, we've got the fire in North Macedonia. I'm lost for words. I can't believe this is still allowed to happen in 2025. It just boggles the mind. Why is this allowed to occur? Well, corruption. This club should have never opened. They should have never had any guests inside. They should have never set off any fireworks. The whole thing was wrong. And the fact 59 people lost their lives, I just can't imagine what the families are going through right now. As I said, legal proceedings are still ongoing, so I hope that those responsible are held fully accountable. But as always, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts below. But just before you go, if you like these kind of videos, then you should check out my Patreon.
Yeah, definitely give this guy a follow. Tragedy Tales, really good. He's definitely growing on me. I subscribed to him like a couple years ago. He's really good. And yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know your comments. Like, I would love to hear from you guys more. I'm a small channel. I don't get a lot of comments, but I would appreciate comments. And yeah, let me know what you think. And has anything crazy like this ever happened to you guys? Has anything, like, what do you think? You know, this, to me, it's insane. Like, those tragedies are all crazy. Like the plane, of course, if he's making his own modifications, aircraft should have, like, inspections done and they would never let you reuse old parts. So like that's a big no-no. I don't know how the pilot was allowed to do that, and I don't know why he even thought it was okay to do that. But like the drag car, that's just unfortunate but that happens. And then the crushing, like that I just explained, and then the fire, well, that's happened quite a few times at clubs. There's fires, nobody can get out, there's only one or two exits, everyone's trying to get to the exit, and they burn. 59 people, that's a lot. I thought it was like the father that was talking he said it was like 200. At least it's not 200, but 59 is still a heck of a lot. Like burning to death, that's one of the worst ways to go. Anyways, let me know your thoughts, and if you can, like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Anyways, until next time, stay safe and take care of yourselves. Peace.